The Barclay family is one of the United Kingdom's most influential and secretive business dynasties, synonymous with wealth, media power, and reclusiveness. Their fortune was primarily built by the twin brothers, Sir David and Sir Frederick Barclay, who rose from small-scale post-war London property dealing to create a vast multi-industry empire spanning retail, hotels, and media. Over several decades, the Barclay family shaped significant sectors of Britain, with notable assets including the Telegraph Media Group and the Ritz Hotel in London. Their fortune, estimated at its peak to be worth £7 to £8 billion, has been preserved through complex private companies and trusts, largely held offshore. Their legacy includes considerable political influence through their newspapers and philanthropic activities. Despite their achievements, the family's history has been marked by persistent tax controversies and an acrimonious internal succession battle from humble origins to a hidden fortune. David and Frederick Barclay were born on October 27, 1934, in Hammersmith, London. They were part of a large, middle-class family with a total of 10 children. Their father, Frederick A. Barclay Sr., was a traveling salesman for a confectionery company. His job, which involved constant travel, was respectable but precarious, providing the family with a modest but unstable income. Their mother, Fiona McKee, was a homemaker. This was not the abject poverty of the Victorian slums, but it was a life of profound modesty, a world entirely removed from the Mayfair aristocracy they would one day challenge. The pivotal traumatic event that shattered this stability, and which, according to biographers like Jane Martinson, forged the twins' famous codependency, was the death of their father in 1953. The twins were just 12 or 13. His death, the result of an accident, plunged the family into genuine financial hardship. This sudden loss, as chronicled in Martinson's 2023 biography, The Barclay Brothers, Billionaires at Bay, is widely seen as the psychological forge of their entire lives. It instilled in them a primal, lifelong fear of poverty, a deep-seated mistrust of the outside world, and an unbreakable, almost pathological reliance on each other. They were, from that moment, a two-man unit against a world they perceived as indifferent and hostile. They had already left school at 15, a common decision for boys of their class at the time to enter the workforce at its lowest rungs. David found work as a clerk in the accounts department of the General Electric Company. Frederick worked as a messenger for a city advertising agency. These were not jobs of opportunity, they were roles of observation. They were the invisible boys in the corridors of power, watching the mechanics of a financial and social system that was not built for them, and in which they had no stake. Their first foray into entrepreneurship, a small tobacconist and confectionery shop in the Hillgate neighborhood, was by all accounts a failure. This early public collapse, as The Guardian's 2023 profile noted, was a humiliation that taught them a critical lesson. They would never again allow their failures or their finances to be public. Their true ascent began in the late 1950s, not with a grand vision, but with a gritty, opportunistic trade. They became estate agents, learning the London property market from the ground up. They were not theorists, they were traders, and they spotted an opportunity that the old money property families of London, with their vast ancestral estates in Belgravia and Mayfair, either missed or disdained. London was still scarred by the Blitz. The inner city neighborhoods, particularly areas like Notting Hill and Kensington, were filled with dilapidated, often war-damaged, Victorian and Edwardian boarding houses. These once grand homes were now squalid, multi-occupancy tenements. As the UK Economic History Society noted, this period coincided with two massive economic booms, a 30% surge in tourism in the 1960s, and a wave of urbanization as people moved to the city for work. London was desperate for cheap, short-term accommodation. This was the Barclays' niche. In 1960, they formed Barclay Brothers Limited. Their business model, as described in a 2023 Financial Times historical analysis, was simple, brutal, and relentless. They would buy one of these decaying boarding houses, often with borrowed money. They would perform the most basic, cost-effective conversions themselves to turn it into small functional flatlets or a cheap hotel. Then, they would use the high turnover rental income from that property to secure a loan for the next. This was not glamorous development. It was industrial-scale property flipping. It was a cash flow machine built on the unglamorous end of the market. While their competitors were building glass towers, the Barclays were converting basements. This work was highly profitable. By the 1970s, their property empire, now numbering in the hundreds of buildings, was reportedly generating revenues of £1 million per year, a significant fortune at the time. But this success came with a social cost that would define their entire lives. To the established British elite, the hereditary landowners and city bankers, the Barclay twins were vulgar parvenus. They were dismissed with a classist sneer that would follow them forever. They were merely former estate agents. This snub was the second great formative event of their lives. They had achieved wealth, but they were denied status. This rejection, The Guardian noted, is believed to have fueled a profound and lasting psychological insecurity. Their response was twofold. First, they would become richer, more powerful, and more ruthless than the elite that rejected them. Second, they would make themselves invisible to them. They would build a fortress of secrecy so high that no one could look down on them again. This was the birth of their dark past. The first layer of the fortress was financial. As their property profits grew in the 1970s, the brothers began systematically moving their wealth offshore. This was not a move they made later in life. It was engineered into their business from its early days. The 2016 Panama Papers leak, reported by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, would later confirm the existence of Barclay-linked companies in the British Crown dependencies of Jersey and Guernsey, established during this period. This network was designed to obscure their profits and, as Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs would later investigate, allegedly evade millions in British taxes. This was the origin of their secret treasury, a financial base hidden from the UK exchequer. By the 1980s, fueled by this offshore tax-light capital, their tactics grew more aggressive and sophisticated. They were no longer just property flippers. The United Kingdom's economy, particularly during the deep recessions of the early 1980s under Margaret Thatcher's government, was a volatile landscape of corporate winners and losers. High interest rates and financial deregulation created a brutal environment. A 1985 analysis in the Financial Times accused the brothers of perfecting what would later be known as vulture tactics. They had vast, private, untraceable cash reserves when others had only debt. They would wait patiently for other companies, hotels, or property holders to go bankrupt or fall into receivership. Then they would strike, buying these distressed assets for pennies on the pound. They would hold them, wait for the market to inevitably recover, and then sell for enormous profits. This was legal, but it earned them a reputation in the City of London, not as respectable businessmen, but as ruthless, predatory opportunists. This period also marked their expansion beyond simple property. They moved into banking and investment, further diversifying their portfolio, and crucially, their methods of generating profit. They acquired small, often struggling banks and lending institutions. This allowed them to leverage their capital in new ways, engaging in high-interest lending and other financial ventures that remained, as always, firmly outside public view. Their business model was becoming a closed loop. Profits from property were funneled offshore, that offshore capital was used to buy banks, and those banks were then used to finance further acquisitions. It was a self-perpetuating, self-concealing money machine. But this financial success only exacerbated their core psychological conflict. By the end of the 1980s, the twins were no longer just millionaires. They were worth hundreds of millions, well on their way to becoming billionaires. Yet, in the rigid, class-obsessed hierarchy of Thatcher-era Britain, they were still the former estate agents. They had the wealth of the aristocracy, but none of its acceptance. This persistent snub, this dark past of being dismissed as nouveau riche parvenu, became the defining obsession of their lives. It was not enough to be rich. They needed to be legitimate. They needed to be respected. This profound insecurity, born from their humble origins and hardened by the snobbery of the old money elite, created the powerful and contradictory dual strategy that would define the rest of their lives. On the one hand, they would aggressively pursue the trappings of establishment legitimacy. On the other, they would simultaneously create an impenetrable physical and legal fortress to shield themselves from that very same world. The first strategy was a conventional pursuit of status. They began to donate significant, though often private, sums to charitable causes, particularly in medicine and education. This was the traditional path of the newly wealthy seeking societal acceptance, a campaign that would eventually, after this period, reach its zenith in 2000 when they were awarded knighthoods by Queen Elizabeth II for their services to charity. They began, albeit awkwardly, to navigate the edges of the establishment, making connections and demonstrating that their wealth could be useful. They were no longer just taking. They were, in a carefully curated way, giving back. This was the public-facing side of their ambition, the part of them that craved a knighthood, a title, a nod of acceptance from the Queen. The second strategy, however, was far more revealing, complex, and unconventional. This was the creation of their fortress of secrecy. This was the part of them that, having been snubbed, decided to build a world so high and so private that the establishment could not just look down on them. It couldn't see them at all. This strategy was rooted in their core belief, forged in their father's death and their early business failures, that the world was hostile and that privacy was the only true defense. This fortress had several layers. The first, their offshore financial network, was already in place. The second was a wall of legal intimidation. Even in the 1980s, the brothers were becoming notorious in Fleet Street for their litigiousness. They began to use the UK's stringent libel laws, not as a shield to correct falsehoods, but as a sword to punish and intimidate any journalist who dared to investigate their business affairs. This creation of a chilling effect was a deliberate strategy, an extension of their desire for total control over their own narrative. By the close of 1989, the Barclay twins had completed the first foundational phase of their empire. They had emerged from obscurity and amassed a colossal hidden fortune. They had perfected a ruthless model of acquisition and a sophisticated tax-minimizing offshore structure to protect their profits. They were, by any measure, a financial success story. But they were, in their own minds, a social failure. They were the ghosts at the feast of the British establishment, immensely powerful, but invisible and unrespected. This deep, burning conflict within them, the desire for legitimacy versus the need for secrecy, the craving for acceptance versus the instinct to build walls, created an unstable and explosive ambition. The 1980s had been about accumulating the money. The 1990s would be about spending it to buy the power. They were now ready to emerge from the shadows, not as supplicants to the British establishment, but as its new owners. They were ready to start buying its most powerful, its most iconic, and its most vulnerable institutions. Buying the establishment. The dawn of the 1990s marked the great pivot of the Barclay dynasty. The preceding decades, as chronicled in Part 2, had been a single-minded, almost monastic period of relentless and invisible capital accumulation. Operating from the shadows of the post-war London property market, the brothers had successfully transmuted their early, gritty ventures in dilapidated boarding houses into a vast, offshore-funded treasury. They had built the engine. The 1990s was when they would finally attach it to the world, and in doing so, begin to reshape the world to their will. Having been forged in the crucible of class-based exclusion, forever branded in their own minds as the former estate agents, their strategy was now twofold. They needed to acquire the unassailable symbols of the establishment that had rejected them, and they needed to acquire the weapons to influence and control that same establishment. This new phase was not about mere wealth. It was about the acquisition of power, both social and political. It was a campaign of strategic conquest. But before the conquest could begin, the conquerors needed a new, impregnable command center. Their existing web of offshore offices in Jersey and Guernsey was a financial fortress, but they now sought a physical and symbolic one. They desired a base of operations that would be a physical manifestation of their psychology, private, sovereign, and completely under their control. In 1993, they found it. For a reported £2.3 million, they purchased the tiny 80-acre island of Brecqhou in the Channel Islands. This was not a casual purchase of a holiday home. It was a profound strategic and psychological statement. The island was a barren granite rock, windswept and inhospitable. But it possessed one supreme virtue. It was not the United Kingdom. It was a crown dependency, a famously opaque tax haven, and most importantly, it was private. The brothers immediately began to pour a vast undisclosed fortune into the island, a sum later estimated by the Times to be in excess of £30 million. This was not a construction project. It was the creation of a private kingdom. They built a massive neo-Gothic castle, a fantasy of power and paranoia, complete with stone walls, turrets, helipads, and a drawbridge. They planted tens of thousands of trees, carving gardens and lakes from the bare rock. It was a fortress designed to repel the world, a physical embodiment of the secrecy that had defined their entire lives. This act, however, immediately revealed the central, driving obsession of their personalities, the desire for absolute sovereignty. Brecqhou was not, as they had perhaps hoped, a lawless vacuum. It fell under the ancient legal and feudal jurisdiction of the neighboring larger island of Sark, a tiny 4.4 square kilometer island that was at the time the last remaining feudal state in Europe. Sark was governed by a 400-year-old system, the chief pleas, and its ancient laws held sway over the Barclays. This was an intolerable situation for the two men who had spent their lives escaping the control of others. They could not bear to be subject to any authority but their own, especially the authority of a tiny 600-person community. What followed was a bizarre, costly, and decade-long legal and political war, a conflict that would define their relationship with the outside world. The Barclay brothers launched a sustained assault against the government of Sark, filing numerous complex lawsuits in the high courts of both Guernsey and the UK publicly. They framed their campaign as a philanthropic effort to modernize Sark and introduce democracy to its ancient feudal system. This narrative was, as The Guardian and other publications chronicled, seen by critics as a grotesque irony. Here were two unelected autocratic billionaires operating from a private fortress, claiming to be champions of democracy. The 600 residents of Sark saw the campaign for what it was, an act of feudalism in reverse. It was, they alleged, a hostile act of billionaire bullying, an attempt to use their immense wealth and legal firepower to crush a tiny community and rewrite its national laws for their own personal convenience and financial benefit. They were accused of wanting to create their own microstate, a personal fiefdom where their own rules would apply. This protracted, bitter legal war, which they would ultimately lose in many respects, was the first defining public-facing act of their new era of power. It was from this newly constructed, legally contested, and physically fortified position on Brecau that the twins would launch their true conquest of the mainland. With their command center established, they turned their attention and their vast offshore wealth to the trophy assets they had coveted for so long. The year 1995 would be the landmark year, the moment the invisible moguls emerged as the most significant and most feared new players in the British establishment. In that single year, they deployed their private, untraceable capital in two near simultaneous and deeply symbolic transactions, capturing both a pillar of the press and a palace of the elite. The first move was into the contentious and influential world of media. In 1995, they acquired the Scotsman newspaper for a reported £85 million. This was not a tentative step. It was a significant and calculated investment into a high-stakes market. The Scotsman, founded in 1817, was not just a regional newspaper, it was a national institution, the paper of record for the Scottish establishment, its academics, its lawyers, and its political class. The timing of this acquisition was exceptionally astute. The mid-1990s in Scotland was a period of intense political ferment. The demand for devolution, the return of a Scottish Parliament from Westminster, was reaching a fever pitch, a debate that would culminate in the 1997 referendum and the establishment of the Scottish Parliament in 1999. By purchasing the Scotsman, the Barclay twins were not just buying a newspaper, they were buying a powerful seat at the table of a nation's constitutional reimagining. They instantly gained a voice in the most important political debate of Scotland's modern history. For the Barclays, this was the perfect testbed for their absentee mogul model. It allowed them to learn the mechanics of owning and influencing a major politically charged media asset without ever having to be physically present. The operations were managed from afar, the editorial direction subtly guided to reflect their own conservative and, importantly, Eurosceptic views. It was a crucial dress rehearsal for the far larger media prize they would one day capture. Furthermore, the acquisition of a 180-year-old broadsheet newspaper provided a significant boost to their quest for legitimacy. It was a far cry from the world of London property flipping. It was the respectable pursuit of a public intellectual, a further layer of armor against the slights of their past. While the Scotsman was a strategic purchase of political influence, their second acquisition in 1995 was an act of pure, unadulterated symbolic conquest. In a transaction that electrified the world of high finance and luxury, the brothers paid £75 million to acquire the Ritz Hotel in London. It is impossible to overstate the psychological and social significance of this purchase. The Ritz, which had opened in 1906, was not merely a hotel. It was, and is the physical embodiment of the British establishment, the ultimate symbol of old money, aristocratic leisure, and global prestige. It was the London drawing room for kings, queens, maharajas, and prime ministers. It was a place where, as the saying went, no one walked, they glided. It was the absolute glittering epicenter of the very world that had for so long held the Barclay twins in contempt. For the former estate agents from Hammersmith to buy the Ritz was the equivalent of a cultural and social regicide. They were not just buying a building, they were buying the stage itself. They could now own and control the very club that had refused them entry. This was the ultimate victory over the old money elite. The £75 million price tag was, in effect, the purchasing price of a new identity. No one, they reasoned, could dismiss the owners of the Ritz. This was not a hostile leverage buyout in the impersonal style of the 1980s. This was a personal, deeply felt acquisition. And unlike their later, more controversial acquisitions, this one was met with a degree of quiet approval, largely because of what they did next. The brothers did not, as some feared, asset strip the hotel or impose a crude, modern corporate identity. Instead, they did the opposite. They announced they would be the hotel's custodians. They immediately committed a further £50 million, a staggering sum, almost matching the purchase price, for a meticulous decade-long restoration program. This was not a modernization. It was a passionate, historically precise restoration of the hotel's original, opulent Louis XVI style decor. They hired the finest artisans and historians to bring the hotel back to, and even beyond, its 1906 glory. This act was one of profound strategic brilliance. It silenced any potential criticism that they were vulgar nouveau riche who wouldn't understand the asset. It positioned them not as conquerors, but as saviors and patrons, men of immense wealth, but also of impeccable, if newly acquired, taste. They were restoring a national treasure, and in doing so they were weaving their own, previously unglamorous name into its prestigious history. The hotel also served a practical personal purpose. While Sir David remained the more reclusive of the two, often preferring the isolation of Brecqhou, Sir Frederick adopted the Ritz as his personal London embassy. The famous Palm Court, and later the Conservatory, became his unofficial office. It was here, surrounded by the opulent grandeur he now owned, that he would hold court, take his meetings, and discuss the family's most sensitive business dealings. This choice of venue, a semi-public space hidden in plain sight, was a display of absolute confidence. It was also, in a tragic turn of irony, the very mistake, the single crack in their fortress of secrecy, that would provide the opening for the family's catastrophic self-inflicted implosion 2 decades later. The acquisitions of 1995 fundamentally changed the Barclay family's position. They were now legitimate, formidable, and diverse. They were no longer just property magnates. They were patrons of the establishment and players in the national media. For the next several years, the brothers returned to their characteristic state of public silence, consolidating their new assets. The Ritz was undergoing its lavish multi-year restoration, a project that consumed vast amounts of capital and signaled their commitment to their new role as custodians of heritage. The Scotsman was providing them with a steady platform of influence, a crucial test bed for the absentee mogul model they were perfecting. The symbolic culmination of this quest for legitimacy and the official erasure of their dark past arrived in the New Year Honors List of 2000. By the authority of Queen Elizabeth II, David and Frederick Barclay were created Knight Bachelors for their services to charity. The former estate agents from Hammersmith were now officially Sir David and Sir Frederick. This was the ultimate victory in their long war against the class-based snobbery of the British elite. The title was a formal, state-sanctioned acknowledgement of their status, a permanent badge of acceptance into the very establishment that had once rejected them. It was a masterpiece of public relations, achieved through years of carefully curated and often private donations to medical research and educational institutions. This pinnacle of public acceptance was bestowed upon two men who had, by this point, become masters of public avoidance, who operated from an offshore fortress and whose business empire, as tax watchdogs would later allege, was structured to contribute as little as possible to the very state that was now honoring them. The irony was profound. They had been knighted by the establishment just as they were finalizing the financial architecture to, in effect, operate entirely outside of it. With their social and symbolic flanks now secured by a knighthood, the brothers turned their attention to the next great strategic problem. They had a social crown and a political voice. What they needed was a modern, massive, and unassailable cash flow engine to fund their expanding ambitions indefinitely. This would lead them, 2 years later, to what was arguably their most commercially brilliant and misunderstood acquisition. In 2002, the newly knighted Sir David and Sir Frederick stunned the British financial world by announcing their intention to acquire Littlewoods, the historic home shopping and retail group, for an enormous sum, £750 million. To the outside world, and to most financial analysts in the City of London, the move was baffling. It was seen as a profound, almost reckless gamble on a dying business model. Littlewoods was not a trophy asset like the Ritz. It was a British institution of a different kind, a beloved working-class and middle-class institution, famous for its football pools, and most of all, its monolithic 1,000-page mail-order catalog. For generations of British families, the arrival of the Littlewoods book was a household event. But by 2002, in the burgeoning age of the internet and just after the dot-com bubble had burst, the mail-order catalog was viewed as a 20th century relic, a dinosaur awaiting extinction. As BBC Business and the Financial Times reported at the time, the consensus was that the Barclays were making a purely nostalgic trophy purchase, perhaps as a misguided tribute to their own humble upbringing. More cynical analysts assumed it was a simple, brutal asset-stripping operation. The £750 million price tag was considered wildly inflated for a business whose core model was deemed obsolete. But Littlewoods did possess an extensive portfolio of high street retail stores, which the brothers could, it was assumed, sell off piecemeal. The market, however, had fundamentally misunderstood the Barclays strategy. The twins, who had built their first fortune by seeing value in dilapidated boarding houses, were once again seeing treasure where others saw only decay. They were not buying a catalog, nor were they primarily interested in the high street stores. They were, in fact, acquiring two far more valuable and largely invisible assets. The first of these was the company's customer database, one of the largest and most detailed in the United Kingdom, containing the names, addresses, and crucially, the credit and purchasing histories of millions of British households. The second asset was the company's vast, sophisticated national logistics network. To deliver millions of catalogs and parcels to every corner of the nation for decades, Littlewoods had built a fully operational fulfillment system, including massive warehouses and delivery infrastructures. What the Barclays understood in 2002, years before most of their retail competitors, was that these two assets combined were the essential components of an e-commerce empire. They were not buying a mail order company. They were acquiring the entire back-end infrastructure of an online retail giant funded by the front-end cash flow of the declining yet still profitable catalog business. Immediately following the 2002 acquisition of Littlewoods, the brothers began a radical and costly period of transformation. They were not, and had never been, sentimental about their assets. They were brutal in their efficiency. They appointed new forward-thinking management and began systematically restructuring the entire company. Their goal was to pivot the colossal operation from a business of print and post to one of digital and delivery. This involved a massive multi-year investment in technology, building a new, robust, and scalable online platform from the ground up. They skillfully integrated their new state-of-the-art web systems with the company's existing old-world warehouse and delivery infrastructure. This was the move that their competitors, blinded by the dot-com crash, failed to appreciate. The Barclays understood that the last-mile logistics of fulfillment were just as important as the website's front end. While this digital transformation was underway, they continued to publish the big book catalog for several more years. This, too, was a masterstroke. The catalog was effectively used as a powerful marketing tool and, more importantly, as a reliable cash flow generator. The profits from the dying print business were being used to fund its own digital executioner. This transformation culminated a few years later in the phenomenally successful launch of Very.uk. The new brand was aimed squarely at a younger, more fashion-conscious demographic, offering a combination of clothing, electronics, and home goods, all sold on a modernized digital version of the buy now pay later credit model that the original Littlewoods catalog had pioneered. The financial results were staggering. The business that analysts had dismissed as a £750 million folly became the single most powerful financial engine in the entire Barclay empire. According to reports from the UK Retail Association and subsequent financial filings, the newly formed Shop Direct Group, which housed very.co.uk, became the second largest online-only retailer in the United Kingdom, trailing only Amazon. Its annual revenues surged towards £2 billion. The strategic importance of this acquisition cannot be overstated. The very.co.uk operation became the Barclays' cash cow. It was a vast, reliable, and modern machine that generated hundreds of millions of pounds in predictable profit year after year. This was the steady, unglamorous, and largely invisible financial foundation that funded all their other, more high-profile ambitions. It was the profits from very.uk, quietly funneled through their offshore network, that allowed them to absorb the immense ongoing costs of the Ritz's lavish restoration and operation. It was this retail cash that propped up their media assets, which, while politically powerful, were often less financially robust. And it was the immense, steady flow of this new capital that would, just 2 years after the Littlewoods acquisition, give them the financial firepower to launch their final, greatest, and most consequential conquest. They had secured their social status with the Ritz. They had established their first political voice with the Scotsman. Now, with very.uk, they had secured their bank. The stage was set for their final act of conquest, the capture of the true crown jewel of the British establishment, the climax of their 1990 to 2004 campaign of conquest arrived in 2004. The target was the Telegraph Media Group. This was not like the Scotsman. This was the major league. The Daily Telegraph was and is the institutional voice of the British Conservative Party. It was the Tory Bible, the paper of record for the establishment, the daily briefing for cabinet ministers, members of Parliament, and the legions of party members in the shires. To own the Telegraph was to own the single most important channel of communication to the ruling class of the United Kingdom. It was not just a newspaper, it was the ultimate lever of political power. True to their form, the Barclays did not attempt to buy TMG when it was stable. They waited, as was their specialty, for a moment of profound weakness. That moment arrived in the form of TMG's flamboyant and controversial owner, Conrad Black, the Lord Black of Cross Harbor. Black was a media baron in the old world style, but he was facing a corporate governance inferno. In late 2003, he was accused by his own company, Hollinger International, of skimming millions of dollars in unauthorized payments. A corporate investigation, which would soon escalate into a full-blown U.S. criminal investigation, accused him of running a corporate kleptocracy and looting the company. As Black's legal and financial world collapsed, his entire empire was put up for sale. The Telegraph Media Group, his most prized possession, was now a distressed asset on the auction block. It was the perfect scenario for the Barclay twins. It was a chaotic, high-stakes situation where their private, stable, and massive cash reserves, bolstered by the new Very.uk engine, were the ultimate advantage. The 2004 auction for TMG was a media circus. The Barclays were not the only bidders. They faced a formidable array of rivals. There was the Daily Mail and General Trust, owners of the Daily Mail. There was Rupert Murdoch, owner of the Times and the Sun, and there were numerous powerful private equity firms, all circling the prestigious asset. Throughout the frantic public bidding process, the twins remained true to form. They were invisible. They operated from the shadows of Brecco and Monaco, letting their lawyers and bankers represent them. While their rivals briefed the press and gave interviews, the Barclays remained silent. They were patient. And then, at the critical moment, they struck. In July 2004, it was announced that the Barclay twins had won the auction. They had acquired the Telegraph Media Group for a staggering £665 million. The £665 million acquisition of the Telegraph Media Group in July 2004 was the absolute zenith of the Barclays' two-decade campaign to conquer the British establishment. It was the culmination of every lesson they had ever learned. It was an opportunistic strike at a distressed asset, funded by a vast and invisible offshore treasury, and it secured for them the single most powerful lever of political influence in the nation. The reaction from the British political and media class was one of profound shock, bordering on panic. The Daily Telegraph was not just a commercial enterprise, it was a national institution, and it had been delivered into the hands of two men who were, by their own design, completely unknowable. They were phantoms. They had no public record, they gave no interviews, and their ultimate political aims were a matter of pure speculation. The establishment, as The Guardian and other rival papers reported, was terrified. The paper's staff, from its senior editors down to its reporters, were said to be in a state of deep anxiety, bracing for a brutal asset-stripping operation, or worse, a purge of anyone not loyal to the new invisible owners. The Barclays, however, did not do what was expected. They did not immediately asset-strip the company. They did not impose a crude new corporate identity. Instead, just as they had at the Ritz, they initially presented themselves as custodians. They moved the paper's operations from its old cramped headquarters at Canary Wharf to a grand new state-of-the-art building at 111 Buckingham Palace Road, a move that signaled investment and long-term commitment. But this was not a passive investment. The true change was not in the office furniture. It was in the paper's soul. The Barclays had not bought the Telegraph to be a silent, profitable asset like a hotel. They had bought it to be a weapon, and they began to wield it immediately. Their ownership was, from the very first day, an active and ideological one. The paper, which had always been conservative, began to drift further to the right. More importantly, it began to adopt the personal, deeply held, and radical ideology of its new owners, a profound and unyielding Euroscepticism. This was not the mild Euro-critical stance common in the mainstream Conservative Party at the time. This was a hardline, ideologically driven campaign for total British separation from the European Union. The brothers, operating from the sovereign isolation of Brecqhou, saw the EU as an intolerable bureaucratic superstate, an infringement on the British sovereignty they so personally cherished. Through their new newspaper, they now had the power to project this personal ideology onto the entire nation. Political analysts and media historians have documented how the paper's editorial line hardened almost overnight. Columnists who were seen as pro-European were gradually sidelined, while voices advocating for a full withdrawal from the EU were given greater and greater prominence. The paper's coverage of Brussels became relentlessly hostile, focusing on waste, bureaucracy, and alleged threats to the British way of life. This was the ultimate expression of the Barclay paradox. Here were two men who lived, for all practical purposes, as tax exiles in Monaco and a crown dependency. As the 2018 HMRC investigations would later allege, they were men who contributed little or no personal tax to the British exchequer. And yet, from this position of offshore detachment, they were now successfully using their newly acquired £665 million media machine to engineer the most significant, disruptive, and consequential change to British political and economic life in half a century. The 2004 acquisition was the final piece of the puzzle. The 1990 to 2004 period was complete. They had begun the era as shadowy, disrespected property magnates. They ended it as Sir David and Sir Frederick, owners of the establishment's favorite hotel, masters of a £2 billion a year e-commerce engine, and the new, undisputed rainmakers of the British right wing, holding the Tory Bible in their hands. They had, in effect, bought the crown. They had conquered the establishment on every conceivable front. They had achieved social legitimacy through their knighthoods and the ownership of the Ritz. They had secured a colossal modern financial engine with Very.uk, and now, with the Telegraph, they held the lever of raw political power. Their fortress was complete. It was vast, it was funded, it was armed, and it was, they believed, utterly impregnable. But in the very moment of their greatest triumph, the seeds of their destruction, the toxic, internal, and unavoidable logic of their own family succession, were already beginning to sprout, the family at war. For a brief, glittering moment in the mid-2000s, the Barclay Empire appeared complete, triumphant, and truly impregnable. With the 2004 acquisition of the Telegraph Media Group, Sir David and Sir Frederick Barclay had achieved the final piece of their conquest. They had risen from the obscurity of post-war Hammersmith to become the knighted, sovereign lords of a private island, the custodians of the establishment's most luxurious hotel, the masters of a revolutionary e-commerce engine, and now the undisputed puppet masters of the British right wing. Their fortress, built over 50 years, was a masterpiece of secrecy, financial engineering, and raw political power. But this fortress, built by two men, had one singular, fatal flaw. It was not built to outlast them. The empire, as it turned out, was not a single unified entity. It was, as The Guardian would later report based on leaked court documents, a complex and fragile bisection. It was split into two distinct family lines, Sir David's line and Sir Frederick's line. While the two brothers, the patriarchs, were alive, healthy, and in their famous indivisible agreement, this structural division was meaningless. They were, as they had always been, the Barclays, a single entity with a 50-50 share of the entire kingdom. The problem was the future. The succession plan was, by its very nature, a recipe for conflict. Sir David had 4 sons, Alistair, Aidan, Howard, and Duncan. Sir Frederick had 1 daughter, Amanda, who was actively involved in the business. This created a fundamental, unavoidable imbalance. In the next generation, Sir David's line was a 4-man majority faction. Sir Frederick's line was a 1-woman minority faction. As long as the two brothers lived, their ironclad partnership and 50-50 split held this imbalance in check. But the moment one of them died, that 50-50 balance would shatter, leaving a 4-to-1 imbalance in the cohort of heirs. The entire multi-billion-pound empire was predicated on the biological impossibility of the twins living and dying at the exact same time. For most of the 2000s, this was a distant theoretical problem. The brothers were in their 70s but still in robust health, and their control was absolute. The heirs, David's 4 sons and Frederick's daughter, were given senior roles within the empire, learning to manage the assets they would one day inherit. Aidan and Howard Barclay, for example, were heavily involved in the management of the Telegraph media group, while Amanda was involved in other aspects of the family's holdings. On the surface, it was a picture of dynastic harmony and careful planning. Beneath the surface, however, the Cold War of succession was already beginning. The paranoia and secrecy that the twins had so effectively weaponized against the outside world now began to seep inward, poisoning the family itself. The two lines of the family, the majority and the minority, began to view each other with suspicion. David's sons, according to later reports, were allegedly concerned that their uncle, Sir Frederick, might one day seek to break up the empire. Sir Frederick, in turn, was allegedly concerned that upon his brother's death, his 4 nephews would use their majority status to marginalize his side of the family and seize control of the inheritance. The fortress of Brecco, the ultimate symbol of unity and privacy, was in reality harboring 2 competing factions, circling each other, waiting for the inevitable moment of weakness. That moment arrived in the late 2000s. The trigger was not a business decision, but a deeply personal and very expensive human event. After 48 years of marriage, Sir Frederick Barclay and his wife, Lady Hiroko Barclay, began a bitter divorce proceeding. For any other billionaire, this would be a private, though costly matter. For the Barclay Empire, it was a destabilizing existential crisis. The divorce, which would be settled in the High Court, threatened to award Lady Hiroko a settlement worth hundreds of millions of pounds. This was a massive, unforeseen financial liability, and it was a liability that fell squarely on Sir Frederick's line of the family. This created a sudden, desperate need for cash on his side of the 50-50 partnership. To satisfy the divorce judgment, Sir Frederick would need to liquidate assets, and this, for David's sons, was the ultimate act of treason. The core, unspoken covenant of the Barclay Empire was that nothing was ever to be sold. The empire was a monolith, a legacy to be preserved intact, not a collection of assets to be traded. As the divorce proceedings grew more contentious, David's sons reportedly began to panic. They became convinced that their uncle, Sir Frederick, was actively planning to sell key trophy assets from under them to pay his ex-wife. There were, according to the Daily Mail, furious discussions and arguments. The nephews allegedly feared that Sir Frederick might even try to sell his stake in the Ritz Hotel, the family's crown jewel. This was the spark that ignited the Cold War into a hot one. David's sons, led by House of Barclay, decided that their uncle was now a threat to their family heritage. They felt they had to know what he was planning, who he was talking to, and what deals he was trying to make. The paranoia that had defined their fathers' lives, the instinct to monitor, to control, and to preemptively strike at any perceived threat, now took over the next generation. The fortress of secrecy was turned inward. The tools the family had used to fight the world were now unsheathed to fight each other. The target was Sir Frederick's inner sanctum. As established in Part 3, Sir Frederick did not use a traditional office. He held his most sensitive meetings, his court, in the conservatory of the Ritz Hotel. This was his throne room, a place he felt invulnerable, surrounded by the opulent grandeur that he owned. In a shocking act of familial espionage, this inner sanctum was breached. A sophisticated listening device, a bug, was secretly planted in the conservatory, allegedly at the direction of Sir David's sons. The goal was to covertly record Sir Frederick's private conversations with his daughter Amanda, his lawyers, and potential buyers. For months, it is alleged, the nephews listened in, gathering intelligence on their own uncle, the co-founder of the entire empire. The betrayal was absolute. It was an act of corporate and personal espionage on a scale that was almost Shakespearean in its treachery. The very place that symbolized their greatest triumph, the capture of the Ritz, was now the scene of their darkest self-inflicted wound. The secret surveillance operation, as alleged in later court filings, was devastatingly effective. For months, Sir David's sons, the nephews, were allegedly privy to Sir Frederick's most confidential strategies, his private fears, and his desperate financial maneuverings related to the looming divorce settlement. They had, in effect, a live feed into their rival's command center, a tactical advantage that was total and, in their view, necessary to protect the family heritage. But the operation was, in the end, discovered. The exact moment of discovery remains shrouded in the family's characteristic secrecy, but what followed was an explosion that vaporized the dynasty's 50-year-old wall of silence. In January 2020, Sir Frederick and his daughter Amanda were made aware of the device. Their reaction was not one of mere anger. It was one of profound existential betrayal. The trust that had for a lifetime been the indivisible glue of the empire was not just broken. It had been revealed as a grotesque illusion. The other half of the family, their own blood, had treated them as a hostile entity to be spied upon. In February 2020, Sir Frederick Barclay did the one thing that no Barclay had ever done before. He took the family war public. In a move that stunned the British establishment, Sir Frederick and his daughter Amanda launched a furious high-stakes lawsuit in the London High Court. The defendants were his own nephews, Alistair, Aidan, and Howard Barclay, along with an associated director. The lawsuit, as reported extensively by the Daily Mail and The Guardian, was a bombshell, a document that laid bare the family's darkest secrets for the entire world to see. The legal claims were astonishing: breach of privacy, breach of confidence, and trespass on a massive scale. The court documents, for the first time, revealed the existence of the secret bug, detailing how Sir Frederick had been recorded for months in his own office at the Ritz. The public was treated to the incredible spectacle of one co-owner of the Ritz suing the other co-owners for bugging him in their own hotel. The media, which the Barclays had so often intimidated into silence, now feasted on the revelations. The New Statesman and other publications immediately dubbed the feud succession-like infighting, a perfect descriptor for the raw, paranoid, and self-destructive battle that was now being waged in the open. The reclusive moguls who had hidden on Brecco and refused interviews for half a century were now having their private conversations, their paranoid fears, and their family hatreds transcribed for the public record. The defense offered by the nephews, as reported in the press, was almost as shocking as the accusation they did not, in their initial responses, simply deny the allegations. Instead, they attempted to justify their actions. They argued that they were not acting out of malice, but out of a desperate need to protect the family heritage. Their lawyers, as the Times reported, painted a picture of a family in crisis, alleging that Sir Frederick, under the immense financial pressure of his divorce settlement with Lady Hiroko, was actively planning to liquidate key assets. They claimed to fear that he was preparing to sell his stake in the Ritz, the family's crown jewel, and that the surveillance was a necessary defensive act to understand the nature and scale of the threat to the Empire. Sir Frederick's legal team, in turn, painted a far darker picture. They described the bugging as commercial espionage on a grand scale, an illegal and immoral campaign designed to gain an unfair advantage in the family's complex financial arrangements and, crucially, to gain leverage in the ongoing dispute over the succession. They argued it was a calculated act of intimidation and control by the majority faction against the minority faction. The High Court hearing in May 2020 was a public circus. The judge, Mr. Justice Warby, was unsparing in his interim assessment. He described the evidence as pointing to a serious breach of confidentiality and issued an interim injunction ordering the nephews to stop any further surveillance. Most damningly, the court heard video evidence that allegedly proved the nephews' involvement. Security footage from the Ritz had reportedly captured Alistair Barclay, Sir David's son, in the conservatory on the night the device was allegedly planted. The reputational cost was total. The magic of the Barclays' indivisible, enigmatic power was broken forever. They were no longer the silent, unified kings in their castle. They were a dysfunctional, warring family, fighting over the inheritance in a grubby public spectacle. The very secrecy they had worshipped had mutated into a paranoid poison, and it was now killing the family from within. The financial cost was equally immense. The lawsuit was not a simple disagreement. It was an all-out legal war, with both sides retaining the most expensive law firms in London. The Evening Standard and other papers estimated that the legal fees for this single, bitter dispute were climbing past £10 million and would likely run far higher. This was money being drawn directly from the family's businesses, bleeding the empire at the very moment it needed to be unified. This internal war raged throughout 2020, a year already beset by the global chaos of the COVID-19 pandemic. The family, consumed by its own paranoia and litigation, was completely dysfunctional. They were spending millions to sue each other. Their private communications were being leaked to the press, and their public image was in ruins. The empire, which required a single unified hand to guide it through its complex financial arrangements, was now leaderless, 100% focused on self-destruction. And then, in the midst of this self-inflicted inferno, the unthinkable happened. The one event that the entire fragile dynastic structure was not built to withstand. Finally occurred the Cold War of Succession, which had been based on the hypothetical question of what would happen when a patriarch died, was about to become a devastating reality. The High Court bugging scandal was a public catastrophe, but it was merely the prelude to the true existential blow. The internal war raged through the chaos of 2020, a year the world was beset by the COVID-19 pandemic. The family, consumed by its own paranoia and litigation, was completely dysfunctional, spending its energy and capital not on navigating the global crisis, but on suing itself. And then, in the midst of this self-inflicted inferno, the event that the entire fragile dynastic structure was not built to withstand finally occurred. On January 10, 2021, Sir David Barclay, the co-patriarch, the other half of the singular entity, died at the age of 86. This was not just a personal tragedy. It was a constitutional crisis for the empire. The 50-50 partnership, the indivisible bond that had founded and guaranteed the entire £8 billion structure for more than 60 years, was legally and biologically dissolved. The empire's single mind was broken. For Sir Frederick, the consequences were immediate and catastrophic. He was now in his late 80s, in frail health, and completely, terrifyingly alone. He was a man surrounded. On one side, he was in the midst of the bitter high-stakes divorce from Lady Hiroko, which now threatened to cost him a 9-figure sum. On the other side, he was in active, hostile litigation with his own nephews, David's 4 sons, who had been spying on him, and now his brother, his only true partner, and in the end, his only real protection, was gone. The Cold War of succession was over. The hot war had begun. Sir Frederick and his daughter Amanda were, in an instant, no longer one half of an equal partnership. They were, in legal and financial reality, a minority faction, facing a 4-man majority who now represented Sir David's line. The death of Sir David had an immediate, chilling effect on the public bugging lawsuit. The raw, unseemly spectacle of a family at war, which had been headline news, was suddenly overshadowed by the solemnity of a real death. As the Times and the Telegraph itself reported, the family, seemingly shocked into a moment of temporary clarity, scrambled to contain the public relations disaster. A settlement was, in effect, reached. In a public statement, the nephews, Alistair, Aidan, and Howard, issued a formal, if stilted, apology. They admitted their actions were ill-judged and offered to pay their uncle's legal costs, estimated in the millions. The High Court case was, for all intents and purposes, settled. But this was not a reconciliation, it was a legal maneuver. The apology was a means to an end, a way to get the family's name out of the headlines. The trust was not just broken, it was annihilated. The war was simply moved from the public courtroom back to the private boardroom. And here, the nephews had the upper hand. The full devastating extent of Sir Frederick's isolation was revealed just 4 months later, in May 2021. The High Court delivered its final judgment in his divorce from Lady Hiroko. The details were, once again, made humiliatingly public. The judge, Mr. Justice Cohen, excoriated Sir Frederick. He revealed that Sir Frederick had repeatedly failed to pay the court-ordered £100 million settlement to his ex-wife. Sir Frederick, in his defense, had claimed poverty. He argued that he was a man of no assets, a penniless individual whose wealth was entirely tied up in the family's complex offshore trust structure, and that he had no access to the funds. The judge was not impressed. He accused Sir Frederick of contempt of court, and in a shocking moment threatened him with imprisonment. But the most damning revelation was why Sir Frederick couldn't pay. The judge pointed out that the family's trust system, which he described as a series of interconnected offshore labyrinthine entities, was now, following Sir David's death, effectively controlled by his nephews. And the nephews, the judge noted, were allegedly refusing to release the funds their uncle needed to settle his personal court-ordered debts. This was the succession-like endgame. The bugging scandal had been the intelligence gathering phase. This was the execution. The nephews, David's line, now allegedly held the purse strings. They had their uncle, the co-founder of the entire empire, trapped. He was being publicly shamed, threatened with jail for a debt he couldn't pay, and it was his own family, his majority partners, who were allegedly withholding the money. This was the state of the Barclay dynasty as it entered the final 18 months of its existence. Total, unresolvable, and complete paralysis. The empire was no longer a functioning business. It was a snake eating its own tail. The family was spending its remaining capital, its energy, and its entire focus on fighting each other. The leadership was in a state of civil war, with one faction allegedly holding the other in a state of financial siege. And all the while, a far greater external threat was looming, a ticking time bomb that the family in its dysfunctional state had completely ignored. The entire complex £8 billion empire was held together by a massive £1.16 billion loan from Lloyd's banking group. This loan was secured against their most prized assets, the Telegraph and the Spectator. That loan was coming due. The bank, for years, had dealt with the Barclays as a single, reliable entity. Now they were watching this public, dysfunctional, paralyzed family. They were watching a co-founder be threatened with jail. They were watching the heirs fight in court, and they knew that a family in this state of total civil war was utterly incapable of managing, let alone refinancing, a debt of over £1 billion. The war in the palace had not just broken the family, it had broken the business. It had made the empire toxic, unstable, and, in the eyes of the financial world, unfinanceable. The crisis was no longer about if the empire would collapse, but when the bank would finally lose its patience. The mogul's gambit. While the Barclay dynasty was imploding from within, consumed by the familial paranoia and litigation detailed in Part 4, a parallel narrative was unfolding in the public sphere. This was the story of the methods of their empire, the profound and deeply controversial gambit they employed to build and maintain their power. The 2010 to 2023 period, which saw the family's catastrophic internal collapse, was also the precise period when their external political influence reached its absolute zenith, and when their long-standing ethical and financial controversies finally came under the harsh glare of international scrutiny. The Barclay Gambit was, at its core, a single breathtaking paradox. It was the use of a vast offshore tax-avoidant fortune to acquire the most powerful levers of domestic British politics. It was the spectacle of two men who lived as non-residents to shield their £8 billion empire from the UK Treasury, simultaneously using their media assets to dictate the fiscal and political destiny of the very nation they had, for tax purposes, abandoned. This was not a passive contradiction. It was an active, strategic, and high-stakes operation. This section details the three core pillars of that gambit: the architecture of their tax avoidance, the weaponization of their political influence, and the ground-level scandals that revealed the human cost of their disconnect. The foundation of the entire empire and the source of its greatest controversy was its financial structure. This was the dark matter of the Barclay dynasty, the invisible, untraceable mass that held all the visible stars, the Ritz, the Telegraph, in its orbit. As detailed in Part 2, the brothers had begun creating this offshore network in the 1970s, almost as soon as their first property ventures became profitable. By the 2010s, it had evolved into a masterpiece of financial engineering, a labyrinthine multi-jurisdictional web of shell companies, holding trusts, and anonymous entities designed for one primary purpose: to make their wealth unknowable and untaxable. For decades, the existence of this network was a matter of speculation, whispered about by financial journalists, but impossible to prove. That all changed in April 2016 with the explosive leak of the Panama Papers. The Panama Papers, a trove of 11.5 million documents leaked from the offshore law firm Mossack Fonseca, provided the first concrete documentary evidence of the Barclay family's offshore architecture. As the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists and The Guardian reported, the leak revealed a complex web of companies registered in the British Virgin Islands and other tax havens, all directly linked to the brothers and their assets. The leak showed how the family had, for decades, used Mossack Fonseca to create and administer these opaque entities, allowing them to move vast sums of money across borders, acquire assets, and manage their finances in total secrecy. It is crucial to note that the use of offshore companies is not in itself illegal, but what the Panama Papers revealed and what subsequent leaks like the 2017 Paradise Papers would reinforce was the scale and intent of this structure. It was an architecture of avoidance. It was designed to ensure that the colossal profits from their UK-based businesses, such as the £2 billion a year Very.uk, did not end up in a UK bank account where they would be subject to UK corporation tax. Instead, the profits were allegedly routed through this complex offshore system, moved as intercompany loans, management fees, or other financial instruments, until they landed in a trust in a jurisdiction like Jersey or Guernsey, where the tax liability was, or was close to, zero. This revelation, in the spring of 2016, created a firestorm of public outrage. The hypocrisy was stark. At the very moment the Panama Papers were exposing their tax avoidance, the Barclays' primary media asset, the Telegraph, was deep in the trenches of the most consequential political campaign in modern history: Brexit. The newspaper was, at that exact time, relentlessly campaigning for the UK to take back control of its sovereignty, a campaign funded by two men who, as the leak showed, had effectively opted out of the British social and fiscal contract. The public anger and the damning evidence from the leaks forced the hand of the British government. In 2018, as the BBC and Financial Times reported, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, the UK's tax authority, was understood to have launched a formal high-stakes investigation into the Barclay family's tax affairs. This was not a routine audit. This was a fundamental challenge to their entire empire. The core of the HMRC probe, according to reports, was the very concept of their non-resident status. The brothers, for decades, had claimed to be non-residents for tax purposes, asserting that they lived either in Monaco or on their private island of Brecco. This status allowed them to avoid paying UK tax on their global income. HMRC, however, was now investigating whether this was a fiction. The key legal question was not where they slept, but where they exercised central mind and control over their vast UK business empire. The tax authority was, in effect, asking a simple question: were the Barclays really running their businesses from Monaco? Or were they, for example, running their multi-billion-pound empire from the conservatory of the Ritz Hotel in London, a UK-based location? Were they holding key strategic meetings, making critical editorial decisions about the Telegraph, and directing their vast operations from within the UK? If so, HMRC could argue they were de facto UK residents, and their entire £8 billion offshore empire could be liable for decades of back taxes, a sum that would be, by any estimation, in the billions. This investigation was an existential threat. It threatened to shatter the very foundation of their financial fortress. It was, perhaps, one of the key external pressures that exacerbated the internal paranoia and crisis gripping the family in the years leading to their final collapse. This, then, was the first and most fundamental pillar of the mogul's gambit to become staggeringly, unimaginably rich by building a UK-based business empire, and then to use a complex and legally aggressive offshore architecture to ensure that the nation which generated that wealth saw as little of the tax revenue as possible. This tax-free offshore treasury was the dry powder for the second and far more public phase of their gambit, the acquisition and weaponization of political power. This vast offshore and allegedly tax-avoidant treasury was the dry powder for the second and far more public phase of their gambit, the acquisition and weaponization of political power. If the financial structure was their invisible shield, the Telegraph Media Group was their very visible and very sharp sword. The Barclays' ownership of the Telegraph, as established in Part 3, was never a passive hands-off investment. They had not purchased the paper to be a trophy asset like the Ritz, to be polished and admired. They had purchased it to be a weapon, and from 2010 onwards, as the European political and financial crises deepened, they began to wield that weapon with a singular ideological purpose: Brexit. The brothers were not typical, pragmatic, pro-business conservatives. Their wealth was so vast and so insulated from the UK economy that they were not concerned with minor fluctuations in trade. They were, at their core, ideologues. They were, like their father, deeply nationalistic, and as their battle with the island of Sark had proven, pathologically obsessed with the concept of sovereignty. They viewed the European Union with its regulations, its courts, and its supranational authority as an intolerable infringement, an echo of the very establishment control they had spent their entire lives fighting. From 2010, the Telegraph became the primary, relentless drumbeat for Euroscepticism in the United Kingdom. It was not just reporting the news, it was creating the political weather. It elevated anti-EU politicians, giving a respectable broadsheet platform to voices like Nigel Farage, and it relentlessly attacked or undermined any mainstream conservative politician, including Prime Minister David Cameron, who was seen as pro-European. Many political analysts, such as those at the BBC, have argued that this sustained decade-long campaign of media pressure directed from the Barclays offshore fortress was one of the key factors that forced Cameron's hand, cornering him into his 2013 promise to hold an in-out referendum on EU membership. When that referendum was finally called, for June 2016, the mogul's gambit went from a Cold War to a hot one. The Telegraph did not just endorse leave. It became the de facto media headquarters and propaganda wing of the Leave campaign. The campaign was waged on two fronts. The first was the editorial line. The newspaper's coverage became a relentless torrent of anti-EU, pro-sovereignty messaging. Every front page, every op-ed, and every news story was framed through this single lens. The second front was financial. As BBC media analysts and The Guardian reported, the Barclays did not just use their paper's voice, they used its money. They reportedly spent as much as £1 million of the company's funds on pro-Brexit advertising wraps and special supplements, a move that was not journalism, but a raw multi-million-pound in-kind political donation. This was the ultimate expression of the Barclay paradox, the most powerful, effective, and relentless campaign for British sovereignty was being funded and directed by two men who were at that very moment being exposed by the Panama Papers as non-resident tax exiles. They were, in effect, shaping the sovereign destiny of a nation whose taxes they allegedly did not fully pay. The Leave victory in June 2016 was not the end of their gambit. It was the end of Phase 1. Phase 2 was to ensure that a true believer took power to deliver the hard, uncompromising version of Brexit that they had campaigned for. Their chosen candidate was the former Mayor of London and Telegraph columnist Boris Johnson. Throughout the political chaos that followed the referendum, the fall of David Cameron, the fraught premiership of Theresa May, the Telegraph acted as Johnson's personal PR machine. It championed his every move and savaged his rivals. This culminated in the 2019 Conservative leadership race. The paper's support for Johnson was so blatant, so overwhelmingly positive, that it crossed a clear line from endorsement to advocacy. The bias was so profound that it triggered a formal investigation by Ofcom, the UK's independent media regulator. The complaint, as detailed by the regulator, was that the Telegraph was failing in its duty of impartiality during an election period, effectively acting as an arm of the Johnson campaign. While Ofcom ultimately did not uphold the complaint on the grounds of the UK's specific press ownership rules, the fact of the investigation was a damning indictment. It was official, regulatory acknowledgement of what had become obvious. The Barclays were using their media asset to actively install their chosen candidate into 10 Downing Street. They won. In July 2019, Boris Johnson became Prime Minister. The Barclays' influence was at its absolute zenith. They had successfully used their tax-avoidant wealth to buy a political weapon, use that weapon to win a generation-defining ideological war, and then used it again to anoint the leader of the world's fifth largest economy. This, then, was the mogul's gambit in its awesome, terrifying totality. But while this grand geopolitical drama was playing out on the front pages of the Telegraph, a far more sordid and perhaps more revealing scandal was brewing back at the very heart of their empire of luxury, the Ritz Hotel. This was the third pillar of their controversial legacy, one that showed the profound ground-level disconnect between the billionaires in their castle and the real-world impact of their financial practices. The political and tax avoidance gambits were, for the Barclays, high-level, strategic, and almost abstract. They were games played on a global scale, involving offshore law firms and prime ministers. But the third pillar of their controversial legacy was far more personal. It was the ground-level reality of their disconnect, the scandals that revealed a profound, almost feudal, disdain for the very common people their newspapers claimed to champion. This was most vividly illustrated in two separate but thematically linked controversies: the labor dispute at their greatest trophy asset, the Ritz, and their long-running bizarre war against the tiny island of Sark. The scandal at the Ritz Hotel erupted fittingly in 2016, the annus horribilis for the Barclays' public image. At the very same moment the Panama Papers were exposing their tax avoidance architecture, and the Telegraph was spending a reported £1 million on its political campaign for Brexit, a furious dispute was brewing within the gilded walls of their London palace. The dispute was not about high politics, but about basic wages, and most pointedly, about tips. The Independent Workers' Union of Great Britain, a small but aggressive union known for representing low-wage and gig economy workers, launched a public campaign against the Ritz. They accused the hotel's management, and by extension the Barclay owners, of exploiting its lowest-paid staff, including cleaners, waiters, kitchen porters, and bellhops. The core of the allegation, as chronicled by The Guardian, was not that the hotel was paying illegal wages, but that it was engaging in a deeply deceptive practice regarding the service charge. Guests at the Ritz, one of the most expensive hotels in the world, paid a significant automatic service charge on their bills, reasonably assuming that this money was a gratuity distributed directly to the staff who had served them. The IWGB alleged this was not the case. Instead, they claimed the Ritz was using this vast pool of tip money to subsidize its own basic payroll. In effect, the hotel was allegedly using its customers' tips to help pay its staff their basic minimum wage salaries, rather than distributing the tips as an additional bonus on top of those wages. The union argued that this practice, while technically legal, was a gross deception of both the public and the staff. It meant that the billionaire owners were, in effect, using their customers' generosity to lower their own labor costs. The image was devastating. The Barclays, two men who were at that very moment being exposed as non-resident tax exiles, and who were simultaneously spending a fortune to realign the nation's political destiny, were now being publicly accused of being tip thieves. The optics were a public relations catastrophe. The owners of a hotel that charged thousands per night were allegedly and mean-spiritedly withholding the tips intended for their minimum wage, often immigrant workforce. The union staged protests outside the hotel's famous entrance, a spectacle that drew in rival media, all too happy to report on the hypocrisy of the owners of the Telegraph. The scandal provided a stark ground-level glimpse into the Barclay mindset, a relentless focus on financial extraction, utterly disconnected from the human cost or the public perception of their actions. This same mindset, an almost feudal intolerance for any authority or community interest that conflicted with their own personal convenience, was even more vividly illustrated in their long-running war against the tiny island of Sark. As detailed in Part 2, the brothers had purchased the neighboring island of Brecqhou in 1993, building their 30 million pound private fortress there. But Brecqhou, to their immense frustration, fell under the ancient feudal jurisdiction of Sark, a 600-person community governed by a 400-year-old legal system. The Barclays, as tenants of Brecqhou, were legally subject to Sark's laws, including its ancient rules on inheritance and its local property taxes. To the Barclays, this was an intolerable affront. They could not bear to be subject to any authority but their own, especially the authority of a tiny island of farmers and fishermen. What followed was not a simple legal dispute, but a multi-decade, multi-million-pound campaign of political and legal warfare designed to, in effect, overthrow the government of Sark publicly. The brothers, in a move of breathtaking cynicism, framed their assault as a philanthropic campaign for democracy. They claimed they were liberating the 600 residents of Sark from their feudal overlords. They funded pro-democracy candidates in Sark's elections, initiated a barrage of costly lawsuits in the high courts of both Guernsey and the UK, and even threatened to shut down all their businesses on Sark, which by that point included hotels and shops, if the island's government did not bend to their will. The residents of Sark, however, saw the campaign for what it was. As The Guardian and The Times reported, they accused the Barclays of engaging in feudalism in reverse. This was not a campaign for democracy. It was a hostile takeover attempt. It was an act of raw billionaire bullying, an attempt to use their overwhelming financial and legal power to crush a tiny ancient community simply because its laws inconvenience their inheritance plans. This long-running, bitter, and ultimately bizarre conflict, which raged through the 2000s and 2010s, was the mogul's gambit in microcosm. It was the use of overwhelming private and offshore-funded wealth to rewrite public law for personal convenience. It was a clear demonstration of their core psychology, a belief in their own sovereignty that was so absolute it placed them above the laws, taxes, and communities of the nations they inhabited. These scandals, the tax avoidance revealed by the Panama Papers, the political manipulation of Brexit, the exploitation of workers at the Ritz, and the feudal war against Sark were not separate, isolated incidents. They were all symptoms of the same central, unifying worldview. They were the actions of men who believed they were, in a word, untouchable. This belief was the engine of their rise. It was also the source of the fatal arrogance and paranoia that would, as detailed in Part 4, lead directly to their final catastrophic and self-inflicted collapse. This three-pronged mogul's gambit, financial, political, and personal, was not just a collection of separate, coexisting scandals. It was a single, coherent, and self-reinforcing system. It was an ideology put into practice, rooted in the core, formative belief that the world was a hostile entity to be controlled, and that wealth, secrecy, and power were the only true defenses. The controversies of this period were not aberrations. They were the truest expression of the empire's operational philosophy. The interconnection between their tax avoidance status and their political ideology is perhaps the most critical and most cynical aspect of the entire gambit. Their support for Brexit was not just a passing patriotic fancy, as their newspapers claimed it was arguably a core business and financial interest. In the years following the 2008 financial crisis, the political winds in Europe had shifted. There was a growing continent-wide anger at corporate tax avoidance, and the European Union, as a bureaucratic bloc, began a slow but determined move towards tax transparency and harmonization. New directives, such as the Anti-Tax Avoidance Directive, were being designed and implemented. These measures were aimed squarely at clamping down on the very profit-shifting, offshore loan, and base erosion schemes that, as the Panama Papers alleged, formed the bedrock of financial fortresses like the one the Barclays had built. To the Barclays, the EU was not a benign trading partner. It was an existential threat. It was, in effect, the island of Sark on a continental scale, a bureaucratic external authority that sought to impose its rules, and most terrifyingly, its taxes, upon their sovereign financial empire. Their personal psychological war against the feudalism of Sark was a perfect microcosm of their ideological war against the bureaucracy of Brussels. Both, in their minds, were an intolerable infringement on their absolute autonomy. The Telegraph, therefore, became their weapon in this fight. The mogul's gambit was to fund and drive a massive popular patriotic campaign for British national sovereignty. This campaign, as chronicled, was masterfully deployed. It framed the debate not around complex financial directives like ATAD, but around populist, emotive issues: immigration, national identity, and taking back control from unelected Brussels bureaucrats. The true breathtaking cynicism of the gambit lay in its public-facing audacity. The Telegraph was successfully used to frame this elite libertarian financial project as a people's revolt. It championed the forgotten man, the working-class voter in the post-industrial North, who felt, quite correctly, that the establishment had left them behind. The paper masterfully redirected this anger away from the failures of domestic policy and aimed it squarely at a foreign other, the EU. This entire narrative, of course, ran in direct, grotesque contradiction to the Barclays' own business practices. While the Telegraph was publishing sentimental paeans to the hard-working British people, the brothers' other company, the Ritz, was at that very same moment in 2016 locked in a bitter public dispute with its own minimum wage staff over the alleged withholding of tips. They were, in effect, weaponizing a working-class revolt in their newspaper while simultaneously being accused of exploiting their own working-class staff in their hotel. This entire sprawling operation, the offshore trusts, the political lobbying, the anti-EU campaign, the anti-union stance at their hotel, was predicated on one single arrogant assumption: their own invisibility. They were confident that the public, the readers of the Telegraph, would never connect the dots. They believed that the patriotic editorial on the front page would never be associated with the anonymous BVI holding company listed in the Panama Papers, or with the low-wage kitchen porter protesting on the pavement outside the Ritz. They were operating in plain sight, using their decades of cultivated secrecy as the ultimate disguise. This belief in their own untouchable status, this mogul's gambit, was, for most of a decade, breathtakingly successful. It won them the political and ideological fight of a generation, but it also bred an extreme fatal arrogance. It reinforced their core belief that they were, in fact, above the normal rules of consequence. This culture of absolute, unquestioning control, this belief that they had the right to do whatever it took to protect their sovereignty, be it national, financial, or familial, was the very same culture that defined the majority faction of David's sons in the family civil war. The gambit they used to win Brexit was the same psychological playbook that would lead them to bug their own uncle. In both cases, they believed they were protecting their heritage from a threat, and that this noble end justified any means, be it propaganda, surveillance, or betrayal. The external gambit and the internal war were not separate stories. They were one and the same. The success of their gambit in 2016 and 2019, while a demonstration of their immense power, also marked the beginning of their vulnerability. They had, in effect, tied their public-facing reputation and the reputation of their most important media asset directly to the political fortunes of one man, Boris Johnson. After Johnson's resounding election victory in December 2019, a victory the Telegraph had championed, the newspaper's role shifted. It was no longer the insurgent voice of a Leave campaign. It was now the Praetorian Guard for the new establishment. The mogul's gambit moved from offense to defense. Throughout Johnson's turbulent premiership, the Telegraph was, by all accounts, his most loyal and powerful defender. As the government stumbled through a series of crises, from the COVID-19 pandemic to the Partygate scandal, and finally, the ethics scandals that would lead to his resignation, the Telegraph consistently acted as a shield rival newspapers, including those on the right like the Times and the Daily Mail, became increasingly critical. But the Telegraph largely held the line, framing the criticisms as politically motivated witch hunts by a pro-Remain media. This created a feedback loop of influence and dependency. The Barclays, through their paper, provided Johnson with the vital, unwavering support of his base, giving him the political cover to survive scandals that would have destroyed other leaders. In return, Johnson's government delivered on the Barclays' core ideological project: a hard sovereign Brexit, a deregulated low-tax economy, and a general suspicion of European-style regulatory oversight. But this, too, was a high-stakes gamble. By 2022, as Johnson's government finally collapsed under the weight of its own scandals, the Barclays' grand political project was left looking tarnished. They had won the war for Brexit, but they had tied their flagship newspaper to a leader who was, in the end, ousted in disgrace. Their political king, just like their financial empire, was revealed to be built on a foundation of chaos and instability. More dangerously, their high-profile political campaigning had made them, for the first time in their lives, a major public target. They were no longer the invisible men they were. In the eyes of half the country, the shadowy villains who had stolen the referendum. This unwanted notoriety, this public anger, is what gave the other parallel scandals, the tax probes, and the labor disputes, so much traction. The HMRC investigation, which had been quietly bubbling since 2018, was a direct consequence of this new, unwelcome visibility. The central legal question of central mind and control was in itself a perfect, ironic trap of their own making. For decades, they had avoided this problem by remaining invisible, but their very success had made them careless. Sir Frederick's decision to use the conservatory of the Ritz Hotel, a public, UK-based location, as his personal office and boardroom was a spectacular, unforced error. Every meeting he held there, every deal he discussed, was potential evidence for HMRC that the core strategic decisions of the offshore empire were, in fact, being made in central London. And then, in a moment of almost unbelievable dramatic irony, the family's own internal paranoia provided the proof. The bugging scandal was not just a family betrayal, it was a legal time bomb. When Sir David's sons allegedly planted a listening device in that conservatory, they were, in effect, creating a secret archive of evidence for HM Revenue and Customs. The very tapes they were making to protect their heritage from their uncle were also, potentially, a perfect date-stamped record of that same uncle exercising central mind and control from within the UK. When Sir Frederick launched his public High Court lawsuit in 2020, he was, in his rage, threatening to bring this entire archive into the public record. This is what made the family feud so uniquely catastrophic. It was not just a private squabble. It was a case of mutually assured destruction, where the evidence in the family war was the exact same evidence the tax authorities needed to destroy their entire financial fortress. This interconnected web of scandals, the political overreach, the public tax probe, and the self-inflicted legal war, created the perfect storm of financial vulnerability. And it was this storm that, by 2023, was being watched with growing horror by the one entity that truly held their fate in its hands, their primary creditor, Lloyds Banking Group. The family owed the bank £1.16 billion. This loan, which had been restructured multiple times, was now coming due. In a normal business environment, a loan of this size, secured against prime assets like the Telegraph and the Spectator, would be a straightforward refinancing negotiation. But the Barclays, by 2023, were not a normal business. They were, in the eyes of the bank's risk assessment department, the single most toxic client on their books. The bank was not just looking at a balance sheet, it was looking at a dynasty that was completely dysfunctional. The bank was watching a family publicly fighting itself. As the bugging scandal and the divorce proceedings proved, they were incapable of unified action. This same family was under active high-stakes tax investigation from HMRC, a multi-billion-pound existential threat that could, at any moment, seize the family's assets and place the bank's own collateral at risk. Furthermore, the Barclays were mired in public scandal, from the Ritz labor dispute to their divisive political role, making them a massive reputational risk for a major publicly traded bank to be associated with. This was the true, combined, and fatal legacy of the mogul's gambit. The very arrogance and secrecy that had won them their empire had now in this final period made it impossible for them to save it. Fall of the House of Barclay. The end of the Barclay Empire was not a gradual decline. It was a sudden, violent, and self-inflicted implosion, a catastrophic failure that unfolded with the speed and brutality of a collapsing star. The catalyst was not a market crash, a hostile takeover, or a government investigation. The catalyst was a simple biological and entirely predictable event, a death in the family. The Cold War of Succession was over. The Hot War had begun. Sir Frederick and his daughter Amanda were, in an instant, no longer one half of an equal partnership. They were, in the cold, hard reality of the family's offshore trust structure, a minority faction. The entire complex £8 billion empire, including its crown jewels, the Telegraph Media Group, and the Spectator magazine, was held together by a massive £1.16 billion loan from Lloyd's banking group. This loan, which had been restructured multiple times, was now coming due, with a final repayment deadline looming in June 2023. For years, the bank had dealt with the Barclays as a single, unified, and supremely reliable entity. Now, the bank's risk assessment department was not looking at a simple balance sheet. It was observing a dynasty in a state of terminal, self-inflicted chaos. They were watching a family that was publicly and acrimoniously suing itself over acts of espionage. They were watching a co-founder be publicly threatened with imprisonment for failing to pay his personal debts, and they were watching a business that was the subject of a massive existential investigation by HM Revenue and Customs over its tax status. This was not a functional client. It was a 5-alarm fire. The family, consumed by its own hatreds, was clearly, utterly incapable of agreeing on or executing a coherent strategy to refinance a £1.16 billion loan. The bank's patience, after years of extensions, finally ran out. The family's paralysis was a fatal strategic error. They had forgotten the golden rule of their own predatory past. A distressed, dysfunctional owner is a target. They had spent their lives profiting from the failures of others. Now, they had become the failing entity themselves. Lloyd's banking group took the nuclear option. In a move that sent shockwaves through the British media and political establishment, the bank appointed receivers from the firm Alex Partners. This was not a warning. It was a seizure. This legal action effectively stripped the Barclay family of all control of the BUK holding company, which in turn owned their crown jewels, the Telegraph Media Group and the Spectator magazine. This collapse leaves a complex and dark legacy, a story that will be studied as the ultimate cautionary tale of a dynastic failure. The first and most significant part of that legacy is the Barclay paradox, the profound structural contradiction between their pathological secrecy and their extreme public influence. The brothers were, by all accounts, tax exiles. They structured their empire through a labyrinth of offshore entities, as the Panama Papers revealed, to legally minimize their contribution to the British Exchequer. Yet from this position of offshore detachment, they wielded the Telegraph as a weapon to fundamentally alter the course of British history. They successfully campaigned for Brexit, a political and economic upheaval that would affect the lives of 67 million British taxpayers from a position of non-tax-paying sovereign isolation. This legacy is not just symbolic. It has had real-world consequences. Their tenure as media owners has sparked serious ongoing debate in the UK Parliament about media ownership reform, with proposals in 2024 aimed directly at preventing a repeat. The central question they leave behind is a disturbing one for any democracy. Should two men who are not full-time UK residents and who actively structure their finances to avoid UK tax be allowed to own a major national newspaper and use it to install a prime minister and dictate the nation's political destiny? Their story also serves to demystify their own legend. For decades, their secrecy fueled a host of conspiracy theories. As their empire began to crumble, financial blogs and social media forums buzzed with theories that their entire succession-like family feud was an elaborate sham, a piece of theater designed to confuse creditors and hide assets. The Barclay Empire did not die of natural causes. It committed suicide. The brothers' greatest strength, their indivisible, secretive, and paranoid bond, became their greatest weakness. They failed the singular critical test of any dynasty: succession. They had built a fortress designed to be run by a single, two-minded king, but they left it to a warring, dysfunctional court of heirs. The secrecy that had built the walls was, in the end, the poison that killed everyone inside.